thank you as well, all of you who care about methodology. A main focus of my overview will be when we make causal inferences that we wish will be valid and relevant for human health. For example, when we wish to assess the clinical effectiveness of a diagnostic tool or a therapeutic tool or a population impact of an exposure intervention policy and so on. So this puts us in a situation which is both common and unique. Many people do not care really, and they do not need to care. There is no obligation to care about clinical effectiveness, for instance. But it is quite unique for today, for us. Of course, we could choose the 10 contemporary terms that you see in the upper part of the slide, but as you can guess, it is not my style. In fact, I think it would not be appropriate for a program of high scientific level as ours to choose 10. You know, each of you has been in touch and using in different ways over the years some of these concepts, and therefore I will be choosing a few of them, and feel free to ask about others that I may not be touching upon. As you will see, some of these terms are not so new, but sometimes even the old terms have new definitions. The way we address today the per protocol analysis in randomized trials, the intention to treat the strategies and so on are quite new, as you will see. And then, of course, we live at a time when everybody has been talking about data science and big data and real world data and so on and so forth. And there is all this hype, sometimes all this speculation. Some people, you know, are really talking about a bubble and an AI bubble and so on. So we will see how the context looks like. An important group, probably the leaders worldwide, and here in the audience you have Xavier, for instance, is working from the causal lab at the Harvard School of Public Health. And I would recommend that you take a look at the website, that you keep on your computer a copy of the book, which is not an easy book, but it's still worth exploring every now and then. And then you look, of course, at some of the articles that we will be using today. I'm sure not only me, but quite sure Xavier and Oulaguer as well. And at some point, I would really recommend to take the course that you see here on the bottom right. I took it some 8 years ago. Marc also took it. As you can see, more than 90,000 students worldwide have taken it. It just requires a little bit of peace of mind, of tranquility, but it's a lot of fun, okay? And then there are, you know, the many papers in which Miquel and his colleagues speak about data science and so on. And I think it's worthwhile reminding ourselves that there has always been a tension, a scientific tension between causation and association, and that sometimes we use association when we really are implying that we wish to assess a causal relationship. I also think it is important to sketch, to briefly mention that the attacks that sometimes observational research receives are not justified scientifically. For instance, a lot of clinical research is observational, a lot of epidemiological research is observational, and so is, for instance, research in economics. As we will see, in recent years, in the past 10, 15 years, there has been an increasing relationship between observational and experimental studies. One of the major concerns with observational studies has not changed in 40, 60 years, which is the possibility that we not control confounding appropriately. And this is something that Miguel and Xavier have explained in a very, very peculiar and interesting paper, because they mention clearly that in databases that use claims, podríamos decir en castellano facturas, the way that physicians are paid or that health services providers are paid, the administrative databases often make the information they contain makes it impossible to really control confounding. Because, for instance, it is missing, there is not good information on smoking, on weight, on physical exercise, on alcohol drinking, and so on and so forth. Either the information is not available or it is not of good quality, so that control of confounding is incomplete, as you know. They showed this in a very elegant paper, because what they found was that there was a 5% lower mortality at 8 years among people who had participated in a program of a screening colonoscopy compared to those who had not participated. And this finding is implausible. If you know a little bit of the clinical epidemiology, the public health knowledge, even the basic clinical medicine of colorectal cancer, you know that this is not going to happen. So very naturally, they attributed to the fact that they could not control confounding appropriately, okay? And in fact, they warn us, and I think this is important at a time of great expectations and speculations and promises and promises and promises, technological promises, right? I think it's important that we listen to the warning, the expectation that data-driven, automated data-driven databases and procedures may significantly improve upon expert knowledge may not be realized for many healthcare databases. And of course, again, this is a topic that will be addressed in more depth by Ulage and by Xavier. One of the things I realized when I was having fun preparing this presentation is that certain things have been built on work that was being done 30 years ago, and even before us, before Susana Pérez-Guzmán and Luis Alberto García Rodríguez and many others were trying to work with databases, and before us, Olli Miettinen and Sam Shapiro and Herschel Jig and many others I know well from pharmacoepidemiology. So some of the problems I just mentioned are really old, and we just need to remind our colleagues who have no training in methodology sometimes that we need to care about the information that we collect. We need to try to collect it prospectively. We need information on post-randomization confounders, as I will mention later on. We need to care about selection biases. You cannot start a master's thesis, you cannot start a PhD thesis just with a database, and now I'm going to analyze the data. You first need to conceive the study, to design it, paying attention to the type of biases that I was mentioning. Another reason, another strong reason in my view, to pay attention to what has been going on for the past 20 or 30 years, until yesterday and tomorrow, is that a number of apparent paradoxes have been clarified. They have been deconstructed and they have been overcome, okay? And this is something that we mentioned, several examples that we mentioned here. In this follow-up study, we remind ourselves that we always enjoyed and we enjoy working with clinical researchers because methodological decisions have to be taken jointly with clinical experts, for instance. To me, it is a lot of fun, and I think it carries a lesson to realize that huge controversies that I experienced when I was beginning to do research after finishing medical school. You know, there was this huge controversy on estrogens and endometrial cancer, and Alban Feinstein would speak, and then Olimietin and this and that. And nobody was finally able to clarify what was going on until Jamie Robbins drew this very simple DAG showing what the problem was and what the solution was. Of course, in this paper and many other papers, there is a background of very complex quantitative technology, including G methods that we will mention later. But the important thing is that, you know, I had hundreds of pages with these controversies, and now this is a book that we don't need to read. You don't need to read it, and this is the last time in your lives that you will see it, okay? What I also want to use from Jamie is the idea that to make relevant and valid etiologic causal analysis, we need to pay attention to the study design and conception and conduct and analysis and interpretation. We need to use subject matter knowledge, and we need valid data. These are principles that have not changed, okay? We need clinicians with an in-depth knowledge of the pathophysiology of the disease, and who know well its clinical course in the specific society and health system, etc. Okay? In medicine and public health, data do not speak by themselves. And in the new edition of the dictionary, I am correcting proofs these days, and it will soon be published. You know, I added the definition of data and database, okay? A database in itself does not constitute a study. It does not yield knowledge automatically. This has to do with this idea that we care our research aim at causal inferences for human health. Okay, let's take a look at one of the few colliders, one of the few terms that I chose. Probably many of you already know or are familiar with it. It will suffice to say that the collider is a variable that is the common effect of two other variables. Very often, the common effect of an exposure and an outcome. It may get very complex, as we will see in 30 seconds, okay? Probably many of you have seen over the past 20 years causal diagrams. And probably many of you know that they are not intuitive, that they need rules, that one needs to learn the rules, that you need to practice. I hope that Xavier and Olague will agree with me, as well as Olads and Philippe and Roberto, okay? For instance, here we have a causal diagram that says, if you restrict your study to women with breast cancer, which is a form of adjustment, is a form of conditioning, right? We all know that. It's restricting the restriction to one form of the disease, then you will induce a false association between the BRCA1 genetic mutation and hormone therapy use, okay? Simply by doing something that is clinically appealing. During the pandemic, we had some suggestions that we ruled out because of the problem of collider bias. And I will not go more in depth because either you know it or you will need more time to work on this type of efforts. Very often in the literature, we see a huge technological apparatus and a lot of wording and phrases and sentences and promises, but then it turns out that many of the participants self-selected into the study. Maybe they were volunteers, and the data scientists had no idea that this may induce, that this has long been known to induce problems, to cause biases, for instance. Here, the novelty is that it is written in a DAG, which also shows a type of collider bias. So self-selection is bad, and you need to think about it to know the reasons, and DAGs, causal diagrams, are useful. This is an example that I chose to show that loss of follow-up, the very old problem of biases caused by losses to follow-up, which is not an epidemiological problem in itself. It's just a problem that concerns anybody working with human beings, right? Well, then it may happen that the relationship between the type of chemotherapy and mortality will be biased if loss to follow-up is differential with respect to treatment, if it depends on the type of treatment and on the cause of the outcome, like, for instance, comorbidities. Okay? So I think these are simple examples to get going in working with the low birth paradox, the collider stratification bias, and so on. I will not get into that because it's a very well-known paradox, who has again been deconstructed thanks to the technology, the mathematical technology behind G methods. And now remember, because it is quite impressive, that this bias may arise when adjusting for any variable affected by the exposure of interest. Here we are adjusting by low birth weight, adjusting in the sense of restriction, right? Okay, so I think that many of the studies that we are conducting suffer heavily from this type of biases. Okay, a similar thing happened with Bergson's bias. I was in the 6th year of a school, and I was asked to explain what was Bergson's bias, and it turned out that I did it, but we didn't know that we didn't know what Bergson's bias was really, and there were controversies over the years, and it was not until some 10 years ago when again the group of Miquel and Sonia and the colleagues at Harvard deconstructed what Bergson's bias is, which is extremely important because we conduct many studies which are hospital-based, right? Although maybe it is not as common and severe as we thought years ago. The M bias is another type of collider bias that I bring only to remind colleagues who work in health services research. You can easily hear in the example with the number of healthcare services encounters and hospitalization and healthcare seeking behavior that this type of problems are affecting many studies. And a few days ago at NYU, my colleague Eliseo Vallar was saying, listen, I think we have to throw away all the books that we have been using for years. Sometimes you will see in the literature, because all this has been getting inside the medical journals now for a number of years, and journals as JAMA and Annals of Internal Medicine and BMJ and The Lancet and New England and many specialty journals are already incorporating in the editorial boards experts in this methodology. Here, so you will any day read a paper talking about the backdoor biasing path. And in this instance, it is a very simple thing, but framed in in the language of causal diagrams. So what we see here is the path from alcohol intake to age to mortality induces a non-causal association between alcohol intake and mortality due to confounding by age. Okay, so as you can see, I am quickly just exploring some terms, some stars of the methodological galaxy. The treatment confounder feedback is a very common clinical and epidemiological situation in which the exposure changes the confounders over time. Okay, and you know that AIDS was very influential in developing the G method. And for many years, we were concerned about this type of problem. And it was not until recently that the technology was available. Sometimes a taxonomy of treatment strategies is also useful, both in observational studies and in clinical trials. So take a look at what Barbara Dickerman and colleagues are doing, and I think you will like it. Even the concept of generalizability has changed in recent years, okay? And I will tell you why in 20 seconds. It now applies only to individuals who were eligible to participate in the study, observational or experimental, and they did not participate, okay? It always refers to the degree to which the results of the study may apply or be extended to other populations. Generalizability is only for individuals who were eligible, whereas transportability is the same question, but for people who were not eligible. Why is this happening? Why are both important to assess external validity? Because a lot of methodological work has developed quantitative methods so that the assessment of the external validity is not as qualitative as it used to be in the past. Now there are many ways that you can test quantitatively the degree of external validity of your studies. So as you see, not in the current edition of the dictionary, in the past edition, many of these terms were already explained. But not immortal time. Immortal time is a very, very fascinating problem, which occurs when there is a misalignment of three components: the time at which the evaluation of eligibility occurs, the time individuals are randomized, and the start of follow-up. This doesn't seem particularly complicated, but is essential in the target trial emulation that Montse was mentioning earlier on, that I will briefly address in a couple of minutes. Okay, it looks conceptually not complex, but believe me, it is, in my view at least, complex to apply. I have seen Xavier García Albéniz teaching on this, and I hope he will tell you much more than I can, because I'm not that an expert. Only recently this paper was published, and I was interested in the opinion of Miquel that immortal time doesn't exist in the data. It is us who generate immortal time when analyzing the data incorrectly. All right, very, very pervasive problem. And if you want to know more about it directly from Miquel, please register for the seminar that you can attend online, and that he will be giving next week from Karolinska. These are some examples just to give you a flavor of the problems, okay? So again, many of these terms were already mature enough. You know, I'm mentioning the dictionary just because, obviously, we never developed the terms. We just bring into the dictionary terms that deserve. The interactions between observational and experimental studies, the two types of strategies and so on, were already mentioned years ago. And in fact, I found the first slide of some 16 years ago when I gave this seminar in the department, when observational studies were beginning to be analyzed like randomized trials and vice versa, which is also the case, okay? Now, for instance, here you have a paper in the New England, which I think is fantastic because it explains very clearly very complex issues that involve not just the per protocol strategy of analysis of pragmatic trials, but more than that, as you will see immediately. And you know, the recommendations deserve time to think, the time to think that I was proposing in the first slide. For instance, the idea, the indication that data from participants should not be censored when they stop treatment for clinical reasons, and so on. In a paper that I had the pleasure of doing with Xavier, Andrea, and Javier, you know, we had difficulties with one of the editors, which was not interested in the idea that a per protocol analysis is actually an analysis of what has become an observational study. Now, does this idea capture your interest immediately? Had you already thought that when we don't use anymore the groups generated by randomization, we are into an observational study? So you see here a little bit an example of what I was saying before about the interrelationships between the observational strategies and the randomized. And then, you know, when I was 24, you know, I started discovering papers such as the one you see here, you know, so old. And yet, as you can see, again, some of the concepts, some of the frameworks, we have built a lot on them, and a lot has been developed and learned. You know, 40 years ago, I was going to say 40 fucking years ago, but I will not say. You know, I was writing and explaining this fundamental framework, which is still important today, you know, and it brings us back to what I was saying earlier in the talk about the conception of the study, the design of the study. What answers do we seek to what questions, okay? The papers by Bradford Hill, you know, they are impressive. And I always recommend to take a look at them, like the one on observation and experiment. This is an important message to me that remains valuable, you know, 70 years after, which is that if you want your results, your conclusions to be relevant for humans, you have to test them in humans, okay? As simple as that. So as we pay homage to the pioneers, we can also, and I'm getting to the last part of the talk, we must also look back and look to tomorrow, to the collaboration that we always had with clinicians, to the very close work that we did with them when we were conceiving the studies, okay? And this is something that it has been a pleasure to conduct over all these years, and I'm sure Jordi and Jaume agree with what I just said. When I was a young fellow, this was published, and we were astonished because adherence to placebo, those who had a higher adherence to placebo had much less mortality than the poor adherence to placebo. And of course, the researchers of the Coronary Drug Project did the right thing, which was to adjust Bar-40 baseline characteristics. Well, only years later, the original papers, the original impressos, the original forms of the study were found, on a basement in Baltimore. And Miquel was able to perform a reanalysis with the original data. And they showed that the difference in mortality among adherents and non-adherents of placebo was really very small when you adjust properly, when you decouple time zero from other problems, and when you use G methods, okay? So I think we have here again a fantastic example of the roots that we need to learn from before we used databases 40 years ago, from much earlier than that, and for the progress. And now we come to the recent publication of the target statement, which hopes to prevent misuses of the term target trial emulation, which I hope that most of you have read. Just in case, here you will find a definition, and also the many steps that you need to follow if you are pretending that your study is an observation with a study with observational data emulating a randomized trial. Please note that even the definition of confounding has this peculiar angle. It occurs when groups receiving different treatment strategies differ in the distribution of prognostic factors at time zero. I know that I have only 4 or 5 minutes left, Montse, so don't worry, because these are the final slides. I wish to connect what I said earlier, what Jamie Robbins was saying earlier, with something that was always present in our articles, in our teaching, in our research, okay? To conduct research, no matter whether you have the 145 million individuals that Mauricio Barreto has in Brazil, okay? No matter how many individuals you have, you need a causal model, which includes knowledge on clinical pharmacology, on the pathophysiology, and so on, and a causal model on the healthcare pathway. Why do they take this drug? Why do they like it or dislike it? Why does it get prescribed? What about confounding by indication? Miquel, how come this is the first time you mentioned this essential concept in pharmacoepidemiology, okay? Can we control confounding by indication with some databases? Well, we will see what our colleagues have to say, okay? And there are several examples in this paper. And remember that you can never take methodological decisions in a vacuum of substantive knowledge, okay? So in Spanish, to make it clear, please tell our colleagues who are promising and promising and promising all the time what they will do with AI, machine learning, the expert, blah, blah, blah. Please tell them, what selection biases did you account for? How did you organize the selection of subjects? Do you know, by any chance, that systematic error or bias does not decrease when you increase the number of participants? Do you know the ABC of methods? And this is essentially what I had thought I would tell you in 34 minutes. Remember that this is the frame that I chose. Obviously, let me say, we always work at IMIM, we always work with basic scientists. We always work as well with bench researchers, okay? And with many other specialties. So it's not that we don't appreciate basic translational research, fundamental research, bench laboratory research. Many of our papers show that, right? But in this talk specifically, I thought it was the priority could be what you're seeing. So thank you very much for your attention.